hello, Nick. How are you doing today?
Hey, Wrecker. Great. How are you?
I'm quite fine, and I'm very excited. We have a good old friend back. We have Cathy Urquhart back with us. Cathy, how are you doing?
Welcome.
Really well. I'm fine. I'm enjoying my life. Jan was busy telling me off for doing quite so much work as a so-called retired prof from
Yep.
information systems. But I
You're
am
supposed to
still
not
having
work
fun.
anymore.
I'm having fun. I'm still having fun.
Kathy, we're so happy to have you back because I don't know if you remember your last podcast with us. You're one of our favorite guests ever, and you were talking about being naughty. Naughty.
It was wonderful, and I really appreciated the fact that people kept on coming up to me at conferences saying, "Oh, I've just heard your GT podcast." So I thought that was marvelous. So yeah, and I've done my bit as well. I've been popularizing your podcast to all and sundry as well.
Well, that explains it. That explains the huge spike.
But I think it's interesting how many people are talking about the podcast and how many people are. It's starting to become part of something in our community. So I think, hats off to the two of you for that. So yeah.
What seems to happen is that actually, the younger generation, I'm not sure younger is the right word, right? But it's sort of like the up and coming scholars.
Absolutely.
They use this a lot, and it sort of feels like it provides them with an entry passage, right, into our community and the way that our journals run and what we talk about and what our conversations are and how the game is played and stuff like this. I don't think, Nick, that we intended it this way, right? Not at all. But this is sort of what it morphed into. Cathy, we brought you on because it so happened that recently, right? It's sort of mid-February right now. That there were a couple of community level things that got announced, both of which you were involved in, and I thought we talk about them today. One of them is an expansion of our basket list of journals. We'll get into that in a second. Where you were one of the members of the task force that initiated this, and the other one is a call for a debate. I guess I can call it this about our conferences. So you're involved with the two main outlets that our communities has to offer, which are our journals and our conferences, and both of them, it seems, are undergoing some change, and that's quite big because that doesn't happen all that often. We have outlets that are usually very, very stable for a very long time. We don't fidget around with review processes, with our list of journals and how we run our conferences. So this could be quite dramatic. So it might be a good idea to actually explain how these came to be, right? So we can start with the journals, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, these journalists, right? We have these journalists, and let's talk about the basket and how it came from first, and then we'll talk about what happened, because everybody has these journalists, right? There's the UT Dallas journalist, which is kind of like here in the States, it's the elite. Then there's the Fortune or Financial Times
50
list. There's like 50 there, and that's probably the second list I hear of most often. Those are the two lists: UT Dallas and Financial. And then there's an ABS list, which is
from England. Yep.
Is that England? What other lists are there of journals? That basically people just look at these journals and what else is there?
Well, there's the ABS list. I think this is from the British schools. Is that right, Cathy?
It's the Chartered Association of Business Schools. It's becoming quite prestigious. And I think it's a really interesting conversation the three of us can have about, what is the purpose of these lists? And obviously the senior scholars basket, and I'm so glad that we're going to be consigning that name to history. This idea of a basket has always, I found kind of embarrassing. We call it a basket. You try talking to a dean about the basket of journals and they will look at you as if you are a basket case. So I'm very happy that we've got rid of that name. But I think certainly that initial list was a response to, more managerialism of universities all over the world, deans trying to say, well, what is good and what isn't good. And so the community quite rightly decided that they were going to say, actually, these are the journals that we think are the best in our community. And that overall has been incredibly helpful. And one reason I think that this particular, what is now known as the Senior Scholars List of Premier Journals. Discuss whether you like the
horrible
name.
Horrible name. I don't particularly like Basket, but it's better than that.
It's better than the Basket, but it's still, I think any name's better.
Recker's an elitist. So here's the thing. Of the two of us, Cathy, I'm the person fighting for the working man, right? I'm the common man's champion. Okay. Where I think and where Recker, on the other hand, is a bit of an elitist, right? And he likes we like to say on the podcast that Recker is the person who climbed up the ladder and then pulled it up behind him to make it very difficult for anyone behind him, right? So as an elitist, Recker, you should think that this premier word, it fits your kind of worldview perfectly.
My worldview on this matter is that we should have abandoned, now that we had the chance, we should have abandoned the Basket. Or the list or the Premier list or whatever. But yeah, but hang on, we have a fair few topics. Let's go a little bit into history, because I wanted to say, I can attest to what Cathy said about the origin of the list. Now, this was around 2006 or 7. I was a PhD student at the time. So as I was starting to get into academia, I was introduced to the situation that we had before we had the Basket list. Now, the situation as it presented to me was the following, right? So I was an IS student, and our IS group was in an IT faculty, and basically in the software engineering department. And of course, we, did research and published papers, and we asked our advisors and the people around, where should we publish? And what these people said, I can basically subsume with wherever these people were successful in publishing it. These were the good journals. Yeah. If you ask person A had published in this particular software engineering journal, well, that made it a good journal. And the conference that this person went to made it a good conference. Yeah. So it's very subjective, completely arbitrary in a sense, and very not comparable. There were no metrics. There were no Google Scholar. The H-index existed, but we didn't have tools and people didn't really know about it either, right? There was no journal impact factor. So this is all 15 years or 16 years ago. So it's not by all means a long time. So that was the situation then. And if you see it, my own profile, if you look at this, especially in the early years, you see this in the publication. You go wherever some people told you to publish. So that's what you did.
So I had a different experience. For me, it was this. There's MISQ and ISR, right? Those are the two legitimate journals. And JMIS is almost legitimate, and then everything else was fine. You get eyeballs, but it's not going to count for your tenure, right? That's the story that I was told. So for me, there were two journals during my PhD that you really.
And who's the elitist here? Is it me or is it you, the elitist?
Hey, I was raised in an elitist environment. I'm a non-elitist raised in an incredibly elitist environment, right? But yeah, so that was the story here. And then right during my PhD, the senior scholars came out with the Basket. So what is the Basket? It's MISQ, ISR, JAIS, Journal of the Association of Information Systems, JMIS, which is Journal of Management Information. Then it's JIT, which is Journal of Information Technology, ISJ, which is Information Systems Journal, Journal of Strategic Information Systems. I'm missing one. What am I missing?
Oh, you're missing one? And the European Journal. European Journal.
So
that's the original Basket, but we've now expanded it to include information and organization, which is good because that wins the best paper award half the time for the field. So it's funny that it wasn't an elite journal and yet it was winning best papers. Like when I won best paper a few years back, it was published in Information and Organization, right? And it's this wonderful journal. And then the other one is Information and Management, which I've never published in, but I know everyone respects. And then DSS, right? Decision Support Systems, right? So those three have become.
So can I come back on this, Nick? Because I think there's some very interesting things in what you said. I think one thing I did want to mention is that I don't know whether Jan remembers this, but I remember this very clearly, that in a sense, that list, that Basket, was a bit of a reaction against North American dominance on the journal scene, and almost a kind of distortion that said these two US journals, MIS Quarterly and ISR and JMIS, these are the only ones that count. And so it wasn't just about, it was about saying, look, other types of research, other ways of looking at the world are permissible, because I think part of the missing piece here is perhaps how quantitative MIS Quarterly was at that point. It's improved over time. So, it's interesting to look at the historical perspective, but there's a couple of points. Maybe I can give people a bit of background, because people might not be familiar with the process, and there's some interesting things about the process I wanted to raise here. First of all, it's every 5 years the College of Senior Scholars carries out an evaluation of the basket.
Are the senior scholars a bunch of horrible human beings? Because that's what I think. I don't know who's a senior scholar or not. You guys are both wonderful, but you are wonderful.
Yeah. No, let me explain.
They're horrible, egomaniacal beings, aren't they? That think they can.
Well, I think this is. I was going to raise this because I think the term senior scholar is really problematic, and again, perhaps it reflects a kind of hierarchical view in our community. Yeah, yes, indeed. But, I don't know, don't you think in maybe other academic communities, they probably do have hierarchies, but maybe they just embed them in committees? And at least we have a college, and ours is wider, so we could discuss that. So, in other large humanities-based communities, you'll just have a kind of, a standing committee of an association, which could be a lot smaller than senior scholars. Anyway, for the purposes of the podcast, allow me to tell you that a senior scholar is defined as, because I actually looked it up this morning, all AIS Leo and Fellow Award winners, all current and former presidents of the AIS, all current and former editors-in-chief of the journals listed in the AIS CSS list of premier journals, all current and former conference chairs and program chairs of ICIS.
Oh, guys, I'm going to be one of these one day.
You will be one.
Yes,
Portugal,
absolutely.
The Portugal ISIS. I'm whatever program chair or something. So after that, I'm a senior. I'm going to be one of these horrible people.
Yeah. You're gonna find that there's a range of people there. Then they've added a new category, which is interesting to me, which is emeritus, emerita, retired but wants to retain some kind of connection. So, anyway, the argument is that we are broadening that. It was old white dudes, but maybe now we are kind of expanding the stakeholders, and what you're looking for is people that, have experience and have contributed to the community. But I do agree that it does, I've never known any other community, but it's really odd to have this name senior scholar, and maybe there could be better names for it.
Well, I want to jump a little bit to the defense. I would say it this way, Nick. I think when you look at the external perspective that it provides, you look up what is the definition of what's the senior scholar, what do they do? All of that sounds incredibly and horribly elitist. We're the senior scholars, we're the best, and we make decisions about the fate of other people. So that does sound a little bit. That sounds horribly elitist, and stuff. If you look internally, I do think they're doing a lot of really good things. Yeah. So we at some stage we talked a little bit about governance schemes that we have in our community, sort of the overlooks and who sort of builds task force to look at important issues and stuff like this, so that the senior scholars do that. Yeah. So for example, they do look at, okay, are our top journals really top? Yeah, as Cathy mentioned, every 5 years they actually do quite an extensive review of all the different journals. They launch all sorts of initiatives, whether it be about community, like diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all sorts of other matters that belong to the community. They do look at that. They will task force and do stuff. Some of that isn't really visible to the outside. What is visible to the outside is the name, the list, and this horrible event at ISIS where they all go on stage and say, like, please celebrate me.
The worst thing. All right, I've never seen this, Cathy, but this is what they tell me happens. Right. All right. Which sounds to me to be the most abhorrent practice in the history of any practice. You get on a stage and say, look, it's me, Jan Recker, everyone, quick. And it's like, Elvis used to have these scarves. and he would sweat on the scarf and then he'd throw it out to the ladies, right? That's what you have to do. You have to wear a scarf and then throw it out to the little people that are watching you come on the stage. That's the most awful thing I've ever heard in my life, that senior scholars come up to be gazed upon one after another. It's like this celebrity culture that is a dysfunction in academia. It's like just feeding into that.
But Nick, again, it depends what you do with that minute. I stood there and I was incredibly opinionated about the need for equality and social inclusion in our community, and thinking about the social impact our community makes or doesn't make. So you can argue that it's, as the senior scholar population's got a lot more diverse, there's a lot more women, that, and the great thing about, from my point of view, being a senior scholar is I can say these things. And I can have the platform to do it. So but I understand what you're saying, and it's sort of very interesting. I wish someone would do an anthropological study of the information systems community, because I think a lot of those roots are from kind of quite old-fashioned, I think mainly North American ideas of what academia looks like, based mainly on a scientific rather than humanities model. And if you look at the kind of the fault lines in our communities, they are all about those types of kind of culture clashes, geographical and also, disciplinary in some ways. We've got a sort of scientific model still vying against a more humanities type model in our community. But anyway, we're going off pieced a little, and I wanted just to, if I could just come back to the process, because I thought it was an interesting one, and I wanted to kind of tell people that we really did do it properly. So we surveyed the senior scholars and we asked them, what do you think of the list so far? And basically they were pretty they said, yes, the journals that we have on the list are all still worthy of inclusion. And I want to come back to that, about what happens when a journal is no longer deemed worthy of inclusion, because I think that's a really interesting conversation that anyone who runs a journal guide needs to have, and I'm involved in too. I'm involved in this conversation, but also the ABS ranking as well. So I want to come back to that because I think it's important. So they basically people were fairly neutral about how useful the list itself was. When it came, not in the community, people could see that it was valuable within the community. So for conversations within your community about promotion and so forth, but when it came to business school deans, people were a lot more neutral. And we think this is because, as you were saying before, Nick, that, a lot of people are using UT Dallas and FD 50. Those are the two that, the top schools are using. So, that was an interesting finding for us. Yeah, but we asked people to identify journals that they thought could be conceivably added to the list. And one thing that people might not know is that BISE was one of those originally.
BISE, the German one.
Yeah. But we ended up, after evaluating DSS, INM, INO, and BISE, not suggesting that BISE be listed, added to the list, because we felt it was on the trajectory, but not there. So I think another point to make about this process, and I think this is important, and again, you might want to challenge me on this, but for me, I find it comforting that we went through a fairly thorough investigation of the metrics for those journals. But I think there are, again, some very interesting conversations going on right now, especially about some Elsevier journals. I'm not going to mention any, but I've come across a few in the past 5 years that artificially expand the amount of volumes being published. So the idea is that you can increase your impact factor and all your other stats if you start publishing a lot more. Now, if you look at something like INO, the key thing about INO that actually
publishes very few articles.
It's incredibly selective. So one way to think about journals and how good they are, and this is a conversation that I'm having with Joe Nandakuma at Warwick Business School, because he and I are on the subject committee for the CABS journal list, which is again going through a light touch iteration, is how selective is the journal and how many volumes are they publishing a year?
Yeah. So you said a lot here.
Yeah, sorry. There's the things I wanted to kind of get over to people so people understand what the process was. Yeah.
Well, the fact that Bisa didn't become it, I mean, that's annoying a little bit, because Germans are basically 25% or more of the IS field anymore. And to have the flagship German, you know what I think? So this is my cynical view, Cathy, and I know you're part of this, but I think adding 3 journals to the journal list, because we have 20 some journals total. Yeah. So now half of them are premier. Yeah. What you did is in effect killed the journalist, right? By saying that you can call it premier, but what you're basically saying is, oh, well, the journalist doesn't mean anything because we've added these, we're going to add a few more. And then pretty soon every journal will be on the journalist. I wonder if the effect of this will be to create a big 4. And I think the big 4, in the end, after a decade or 2 of scholars and basket, will have been to grant legitimacy to JAIS. Because now already I hear about it in conversations that it used to be JMIS was a little bit better than the rest, but not quite MISQ and ISR. Now I'm hearing JAIS and JMIS in the same breath as better than the others, but not as good as MISQ and ISR, right? So that's kind of the whatever.
I think what you've just said, is fascinating.
And what I think is adding more journals has just bolstered JAIS is the effect.
Well, this is totally fascinating, because Joe Nandakuma and I worked very hard to get JAIS as a journal of distinction in the CABS ranking. So in the CABS ranking, it's up there with MIS Quarterly and ISR, and it's up there because we call it a journal of distinction. And the argument is that it's a flagship journal of AIS. I think there are conversations about the metrics of JMIS, and I think it has longevity on its side. It has, a fairly stellar kind of cast of authors on its side as well. Yeah. So I think it's going to be interesting to see where this goes. But, the other argument that Joe and I used when we were actually...
and JMIS got on the FT50 and JAIS didn't, so it's a big deal.
Yeah, exactly. And one reason that when Joe and I were talking about what could be conceivably known as a 4, not a 4-star, but a 4, which is slightly below MIS Quarterly and ISR, was if you look at things like JIT, even if you look at ISJ, if you look at Aegis, their acceptance rate is around 10%. We are expanding as a field. We need more journals. And so that's where I think your argument about selectivism starts to go down.
More journals, but more premier journals. This is a tough one.
But because our field is bigger, it really
I think there are 3 tiers. I think there are the big 4-ish, and you could say the big 4 have 2 tiers. Yep. Then there's the rest of the good journals, which are the rest of the basket list, but I would add a few, including Bisa in there, that we know are good journals. So the fact that you added a few to the basket, I think just killed the basket. That's my view. Because now it's like every good journal, and in a few years, every other good journal will be part of the basket. And then it just becomes a membership, right? Are you part of the good journals or not? And we'll expand it to 20 in the next 5 years. Mark my words, there will be 20 journals in this, and they're all in there that are decent journals, right?
So can anyone care about my opinion?
Yeah.
No. Well, I'm just going to keep on arguing with it. Can I just come back on that? Because I think maybe where we might be going, and it may not be awful, Nick, is to have the ranking of all our IS journals in there. So the idea, so it becomes a list rather than a subsection. So
that's what's going to happen. So we agree.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I do want to raise something, and maybe Jan, you could come in on this, because I really did want to discuss this with you too. Because one problem that we've got whenever we add or expand or elevate a journal. So in the CABS list, we've raised things like ISJ from a 3 to a 4. Here we're adding, DSS, INM, INO into the senior scholars list. Now, the argument that we get is you can't do that because this is kind of grade inflation. It's kind of devaluing. And it's a variation of your argument, Nick, that basically, it's not special anymore. Whereas I think I'm arguing that there's a kind of still a ranking in there. Now, the question I want to put to both of you, but especially Jan, because he's been very patient, is what do we do about journals that then, in, say, a few years' time, are not worthy of inclusion within, for instance, the senior scholar list, or in the CABS list, there are a 4, but you think, hang on, their metrics are going down. What do we do about that? Because I have a view on this. I'm interested as to whether you think, Jan, do you think in that situation, if you've got a journal that you've elevated in a list, if the metrics start to go down, should that journal go back down again?
Well, maybe I wanted to say a few other things, but on that question, I would say, well, the only purpose of such a premier list is, of course, that you can get into it, but that also means you have to be able to get out, right? What's the point? You can't, yeah. So that's my short answer to this. So I wanted to say a few things. So when they started this basket, the idea back then was a little bit what Nick always said, is to add legitimacy to a number of journals that were not legitimate internally or externally. Yeah. So they wanted to give back then more options to IS scholars to publish in high quality journals that were recognized as such by our own people. And ideally, of course, also for promotion, tenure, deans, all these sorts of things. Yeah. Well, I think what they also wanted to do at that point was really raise the quality of some of these journals. And you got to say, from 2007 onwards, that did take effect. So the journals were better. Now that they were a little bit more elevated in status, people took a very good look at the review process and stuff like this. They looked at the editorial board, and everything got a little bit more professional. And I think that was a good side effect of this, and this legitimization of our journals within our field, that also happened. Yeah, at that time, we had ISR and MISQ in the UT Dallas list ever since 1990 it started, but nothing was ever added to this. And the FT45, the precursor to the FT50, we had 2 journals, and there were 43 or 47 other ones which were not part of that. Right. So all of that sort of the desired effect kicked in at some stage. Another question is, all right, well, that it served that purpose. What's the new purpose now? It can't possibly be to get more legitimacy and to raise the quality, because apparently we achieved these goals. So what's the point? So here, and because of that, I'm sitting a little bit with Nick here. Now, I'm looking at this 5-year evaluation report. Now, Cathy, I'm not sure. This is not public, is it? Is it one of these senior scholar internal documents? People don't see that, do they?
That's a good question. I think it did just go to the CSS, and I think there was a discussion board. Yeah.
Hang on. So let me continue my point.
Let me jump in on your last point, though.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, go on, Wrecker. You're frustrated. You want to talk.
Just want to finish my one point here. So people, I'm looking at this list. So there's a 5-year evaluation report. It's 30 pages long. As Cathy said, there's actually a thorough process. No one knows about it. Yeah. Because it's this internal document where you have to go through 5, 6, 7 steps of authorization to show that you're really worthy of reading this. Anyway, but when you look at this, you know what I see here, Cathy? They're all the same. On all the metrics you can conceive, and all of which you looked at, age, all these different metrics that we have for evaluating the quality journal. You know what I see here? Like, it's completely indistinguishable. They all have similar review rounds, a similar desk reject rate, similar time to the decision, similar impact factor, similar everything. Really, they're all fairly similar, which is in a way what they intended to do, really, right? So now, the other point that I was thinking, like, well, when it started, none of these metrics really existed. They were not really in practice in use. So maybe at that point, we needed a list where someone designated a journal as being good because we had very little way of telling otherwise. Now, if you go to any journal's webpage, it tells you what the impact factor is. You can look up 27 different ranking lists where it appears. They disclose their number of board members and the desk reject grades and all that sort of stuff is now available, which is now, again, the question is, why do we need this list? Because it's our own. Do you know any other discipline that has their own
This is what
list?
we need. Wrecker, this is the key. And this is the problem. And this is the anti-elitist stance here, right? What Cathy is espousing, and I know Cathy's a wonderful person and not an elitist, but I think you're swept up in these elitist approaches and they're categorical, all right? Where the elites determine, and you're even talking about promoting and demoting particular journals, right? That's a very elitist sentiment, isn't it? You know better. You know better than I knew INO. I know INO is a better journal than, say, Journal of Strategic Information Systems, right? I'll call it out. I'll pick a right? JSIS is on the list. INO is a better journal. We know that if we're in the game and we read these articles, and it's that simple. One's on the list, one's not. Those of us in the game know this. We don't need elites. We don't need elites to tell us anything. And that's what the senior scholars and the ABS are doing. The elites are saying, but this one is blessed by us. This one's not so blessed. So this is the only legitimate working man, blue collar, ethical way to do this, is to not have a categorical list determined by elites using some criteria that are not public. Okay. This is the way to do it. We come up with the criteria and we actually have a journal ranking. We have a first place, second place, third place, all the way through. We should have 40 journals. I don't even know how many journals we have. Let's say it's 40. We should have 40 journals. We should have published criteria that the community values. The only thing the elites should do is decide on that criteria. And that criteria should be review times, because we want journals to decrease their review times. All the things we talked about, maybe impact factors, part of it, maybe, right? These criteria that maybe you used, and have them be part of the list. And we show how they're ranked. And every year, your journal with good management could move up the rank. And now, of course, you're going to get people doing all sorts of dysfunctional activity, right? Because that's what they do with rankings. But at least it's apparent to the world. The criteria is there. So it's one imperfect solution versus another. This is the less imperfect solution because it's not some royal group of scholars on their throne using obscure criteria that we're not allowed to access, telling us what is blessed and what is not blessed, right?
Okay, so can we decouple a few of these arguments? I think it's fair to say that how the results of this exercise have been disseminated is reflective of a kind of the hierarchical nature of the academic community. But when we move to the kind of facts of the situation...
Well, wait, can I stop you right there?
No, you can't.
This hierarchical nature of the academic community in the world, the academic community is as non-hierarchical as you get, right? Now, of course there is, but come on, this is a...
This is the point I want. This is the point I made at the very beginning. This is the conversation we had at the very beginning. Senior scholar, what is that? What does that word mean? Why do we have senior scholars? I don't know of any other academic community that kind of has a label, senior scholars. Now, you could argue that every academic community has its elites, and that's just a fixture of any community. But I think there's two issues here I want to pull out. The first is, I think it's fair and quite interesting to hear you say, but there's no kind of transparency about the process, because in terms of how we did the process, it was, in fact, extremely robust. But there's always two elements to the...
You just put the objection of transparency, and then you turned around and said robust. I didn't say it wasn't robust. I'm sure a lot of senior scholars talked to each other.
I would no, because we actually, we've got spreadsheets, we've got, all our working.
Yeah, I'm sure you did a lot of things.
We have our metrics, so there was a lot.
Transparency was the problem, not robustness.
Yes, I agree. I think that's a fair critique. So it's fine for you to say that. I don't think that's a problem, because I think, we could question, why are the results, communicated in this way. But I think historically, the College of Senior Scholars have owned that list, and it's their job. They would see it as their job to sort it out. They would not see it as their job to consult on every aspect of every criteria. So, of course, you're quite right. They could certainly publish them. And it may be that the report is already been published.
You know what the thing is, Cathy? So the thing is, I think that when you're dealing with the substance of a phenomenon, and you're going to dictate, then you're an elite. If you're dealing with the process and you have some group make laws that everyone is to the same standard and they come up with a standard process, then you're being less elite. All right. And I would have loved it if the senior scholars would come up with a process rather than choose winners and losers.
And I think that's a fair critique. And I think it's a critique you can make. Now, I'm more interested in the second part of what you were talking about. Because I think, I can take that critique on board. It's absolutely fine to say that there could have been, and there probably should have been, more transparency. Though, having been involved in that process, I know how hard everybody worked and how complex it is. So you're saying, well, let's just have a list. Let's just rank all of our information systems journals. And I tend to agree with you. That is where it's going to go. But, I'm not only involved in this process, I'm involved in the CABS process as well. And
again, let's not rank. It's not we are ranking. It's let's publish the criteria for ranking.
Well,
Can we get to
the criteria then? Because the problem that we have always is that there is going to be subjectivity in evaluation of those journals. You and I know that INO is an excellent journal. You and I have been saying this for years. But if I look at the total of votes amongst the senior scholars, I can tell you that the lowest vote was for INO. I can also tell you there was a fairly consistent vote, quite a high vote, against even expanding the list at all, as one might expect. So that's also very interesting. I think those votes have been published. I hope they have anyway.
They have, yeah. They're in the email.
So I think that's absolutely fascinating. But the problem is, as you were saying before, metrics, yes, they're freely available, but oh boy, can they be manipulated. And you do need people like myself and people in the task force, or myself and Joe, with the CABS listing, to actually go through and assess the journal and find out a bit more about it, because there is so many predatory journals, there's so much manipulation. What I was talking to you about before, about the volume and how that can be manipulated. So it's a fascinating conversation, because we're really talking about selectivity and what is good and what isn't. And that's an inherently kind of elitist conversation in many ways.
So I want to go back to the point that I have here, right? So I have very few issues with the process, because I was able to see it, right? So I could access the report. I do have an issue with transparency as well. So I want to separate, Cathy, the task force that is operating within the Senior Scholars Group for the IS discipline and comes up with our own ranking of our own stuff, right? So there's a bit of a debate about like the basket that no one knows about. Well, no one knows the list either, because it's only within our field, and the deans and everyone else that makes promotion tenure, you have to first educate them on the premier list of something, whatever we call them. So that point is mute in my view. Now I want to separate that from the very important though, the Joe and you for CABS and other people for ABDC and for the FT50, this type of ranking list and making sure that IS is well represented there, I think is fundamentally important, because this is really where careers are on the line, and there we are helping the members in our field to do this. So getting JIS, or for that matter, or any other journal, from a 3 to 4, from a 4 to 4 star, this is fantastic, and we need more of that. What my issue is that we don't need in our own field yet another listing, yet another ranking of research performance things that just came out as well, so we can look at who's the best IS scholars amongst all IS scholars. We're the only field that does that. We're the only field that has its own basket, its own ranking, and its own senior scholar committee. And my final point is, now I have no problem with the committee that is the Senior Scholar Group. Like, the college idea is not a bad one. Now, first, it was the only one. Now we have the College of Junior Scholars, right? The PhD Students College. That doesn't have the same significance. If they do something, first of all, no one hears about it. Second of all, it carries no weight for the field. Third, neither of these two colleges are actually part of the governance scheme for our community. Now, if you want to have a group that represents the old people, fine. Then, of course, you should balance that with a view of the young people. Fine. And then you should actually have them be involved in some key decision-making, not just as standalone little islands, one of which is proclaimed to be important, the other one not, So that's my big issue.
Who does make decisions at AIS?
I think I think you've brought up a really big issue, Jan, and I agree with you, Nick. The question is who makes the decisions, and
I don't know.
Well, I think there needs to be a very, very big conversation about the governance.
But I asked the question. I literally don't know who makes decisions.
Okay, who does? Purportedly, AIS Council, who we elect. We elect the council members.
Like
Yeah, AIS members. We all have a vote.
Okay.
Elections are on right now, yeah.
Region by region. So we do have a vote. I think there are big issues. I like the idea Jan's put just forward of the idea of leveraging the colleges as a way of broadening the decision-making, representative of decision-making, I think would be an amazing thing. For me, one of the big issues with the AIS for a long time is you're only a president for a year. And so you can't really enact any meaningful reform in a year. And the other big thing I would like to see, and I've said this before, I think on this podcast, I'm going to say it again, every conference, or perhaps just every year, virtually, there needs to be an AIS members meeting where there's some kind of report where they say, this is what your subscriptions paid for this year.
Yeah.
This is what your AIS council members have been doing this year. And this is what we would like your support on. An AGM would be an amazing thing where we had a vote. And so then people would feel much more connected to the activities of the AIS and see what their subscription is used for.
We don't know what they're spending money on. This is what I think they're spending money on. Vacationing in all these destinations that there are no IS researchers, yet we have conferences or we explore those conferences. So they go for weeks, and I don't know who they are. It's these people who, when we proposed the ISIS, there was like this big group of nebulous people who were talking about hotels and whatever, and then deciding who gets to propose and who doesn't. And so there's this like set of nameless, faceless people who spend a bunch of money traveling places. That's what I think they do with AIS. What do they actually do with AIS?
Well, I want to put this into a little bit more of a constructive. I want to just put this on a little bit more of a constructive spin. Yeah. So again, this is not this podcast is not a political organ, I don't think. But if you think about that, there's a few thousand people, most of which are junior, and they wouldn't know any of this. If they're anything like me at that stage, they have no idea what an AIS council is, how that all works. They see an email like right now, we got an email saying that the elections are open. No one knows the significance or the implication of any of that. I still don't really. I don't know how that works. So I don't know what the task force are, etc. and so forth. So I do think there is a little bit of a job to be done by AIS. So making sure that this expanding field, and it's young people expanding, not old people. It's not all of a sudden we have more 50-year-olds. We have more 30-year-olds coming in because they all find the topics and methods and the journals interesting. So they all come to us. And what are we doing to making sure they feel home, safe, and well represented? So if I go to the ISNet webpage, I feel like I'm in 1992, and I had to log in with my AOL.com account because that's what it looks like, and I can't find anything, and I don't see anything, and I don't see any of the report. I don't know how this organ that is supposed to be my home, how that actually operates, and I think that is an issue that we need to make sure.
You are aware though that the Association of Information Systems started in a North American US context, and I think that's part of the problem. I think it's like a professional association, and it's almost as if its constitution is kind of modeled on a kind of commercial professional organization, professional organization of furniture makers or something.
I'm not sure that is entirely.
No, I think it's problematic. I think that, again, it's the historical roots make it more difficult, that we seem to have a constitution that doesn't really allow for instance, an annual conversation between members, commonly known as an AGM in most parts of the world. You know, generally in the UK and lots of, you would have an annual general meeting. So I think, again, those the sort of historical roots that make it problematic. And I completely agree that part of the problem with all of these things is it's a voluntary organisation. God knows academics are busy enough. So it tends to be people with the time or the motivation to be involved. But, you know, I want to be optimistic as well. I mean, in the past sort of 20 plus years I've been involved, you know, there's a proper conversation about social inclusion. We have SIG Green, we have much more SIG Phil, we have much more diverse, you know, understanding of the society that we live in. We are making efforts, and there's a much more diversity of research methods. However, I think we've still got a long way to go. And what I wanted to finish on, if there's time, is just a big shout out for this case, Communications of the Association of Information Systems debate section that we're putting out at the moment. And that's just to ask, I mean, and it would be lovely, Nick and Jan, if you wanted to contribute on this, because all we're looking for is a 3,000 to 5,000 word piece, very much like you might be talking to me at the bar one evening about this. And really what I'd like you to do is just write it down, and about the role of conferences. And the reason we talk about it, in a way, I was thinking the title's a misnomer, The Future of Conferences. If you consider that conferences build our community, we're really talking about the future of our community. And so what I'm looking for are contributions on what do we think our community looks like, and how do we use those conferences to build community. And obviously there's a huge opportunity with hybrid, there's a huge virtual opportunity, and you know, maybe I'll even answer some of Nick's questions about why have we got conferences in places no one's been before. You know, what's the carbon footprint of that, by the way? And so I really would just like people to contribute if they can.
So, Cathy, we will put up. I will put up this call for contributions. You posted it on IS World, but we'll put it up on the show notes here as well, so people can find it. I would just want to make one call here. I just said, like, you know, we have a lot of young listeners. These debate sections, they're kind of funny. Like in CS and on the other journals, it's always the same kind of senior scholar alike kind of old people that debate, right? Yeah. So, and I'm getting into the age where I'm being asked to contribute to these too, right? Anyway, so what I would love to see here, and I'm sure you would as well, is wouldn't it be great if the College of PhD students in IS, whatever they're called, or, you know, some other young folks would write their piece on this debate section, so that we just don't see the same old voices by the same old people. I can probably predict at least 7 responses that you're going to get with the people, you know, right now. So, and it would be nice to see someone that, you know, it's not 60-year-olds to actually write such a piece, to see how, you know, the future of conferences will look for those that will actually experience it.
We'd be delighted. And that's one thing we've tried very hard to do. We are actually inviting contributions from PhD students.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, because we understand that it's really important that everyone is involved in this debate. So, yeah.
Well, they counter. So as much as I'm the in favor of the working man, I think PhD students don't have the perspective yet. You know, they have some ideas, but you know, you do need a little bit of time and some. So maybe some have great ideas, and by all means, they should publish those. But to somehow say, well, we don't want to hear from the old people. I think everyone.
I said we shouldn't only hear from the old people.
Yeah. But again, I think we don't. I don't like the idea of inclusivity for the sake of inclusivity. We haven't heard from a young person say something. Well, maybe the young person has nothing good to say. Why don't we just inclusively listen to everybody who has something to say? You know, so
I'm not sure I agree, because I think, for me anyway, a big concern, and it's been a concern ever since I joined the community, is what is the experience of a PhD student when you go to something like ICIS? And for some, it's truly awful. It's this huge conference where they don't know anyone and they have a horrible time. And I do think we need to be more inclusive and welcoming. And as the program chair for ICIS in 2015, we were thinking about that. So I do
remember
actually
the
think
doctoral
that
student
for you
corner
is really important. Yeah.
So there have been innovations because of exactly that, right? Like doctoral student corner, and there's some other innovations. But yeah, I'm not saying, so you're bringing up two different things. One is inclusivity in a conference, and you're absolutely right. We should have conferences be as fulfilling for as many people as attend them as possible, right? I'm not saying that. I'm saying inclusivity of people's opinions when they don't have a decent opinion. Then I don't want to hear it, right? I only want to hear. So I think with this debate, sure, if a junior person has a strong view and it's a internally consistent argument that is representative of a perspective, and it does a good job of representing that perspective, an informed perspective, then it's great. Then by all means, junior, senior, mid. But I think we should talk about the perspectives and diversity of perspective, not necessarily diversity of the person, and get young people just for the sake of getting young people. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense. Let's get well thought out, well argued perspectives and get them in there and not distinguish based on seniority, right? Is how I would look at it.
I guess that's right. I guess that's the managing editor's job, is to bring together those perspectives. But I would be concerned if the perspective of, a person new to the community wasn't included, because they are our future. And I do know that.
You mean simply by virtue that they're too young? Oh, we're not going to take this person's view because they're a PhD student. So
I wouldn't
if we're
do
doing
that.
that would be awful.
I wouldn't do that. I just wouldn't. But I mean, So I mean, I get what you're saying. And then you're putting a value judgment on. You're saying that someone, just because they are a PhD student, might not have a view as valuable as a senior scholar. Now, true enough, they don't have, the years and years of going to conferences that we might. But I reckon, if I'd met you as a PhD student or Jan as a PhD student, you would have both had fairly interesting views, even at that time, about the community that you were coming into. So I think, that's valid to, as you say, seek a diversity of perspectives.
I think I agree with Cathy on this one. So we need to wrap up here.
We're running out of time again.
We're running out of time, but we haven't reached a conclusion. Have we reached some sort of conclusion?
What were we talking about?
Well, we were talking about the move of expanding the Premier list of journals. And I think what we've done is, I guess we laid out a whole bunch of it, positive things that might flow from it and negative things that might be associated with this. We try to explain a little bit of the history and the process behind it, but in the end, I guess proof will be in the pudding, won't it? Right? The proof will be in the eating. Good journals with good papers, they're always going to make it. And as I said, we could look at it from three sides. What I didn't know beforehand, we would have three very different opinions here. Cathy pushing it, Nick against it, and I'm sort of saying abandon it altogether.
Yeah.
And I guess that is representative of how people think about it, right? Even though I like most people would say not to abandon or abolish the list, what I usually say.
Yeah. I think you're part of the sizable minority, Jan, actually, in people just saying, let's just not have it at all. Sorry, Nick, you were going to say something.
No, if I were to predict what should we do or shouldn't we do, I'm not exactly sure. But I think as far as a prediction goes, I think what this is the first step to getting rid of it. I think this is the first step to diluting it and having it lose credibility for any categorical distinction between the list and not on the list. Because now I think maybe before, so let's talk about BISA, which is not on the list. Before, BISA was not on the list, so it wasn't as high status as these. The way I'm looking at it now is, we added a bunch of others. The difference between BISA and these journals is less all of a sudden, right? Because now this is expanded. So we're diluting the strength of the list. We're diluting the exclusivity of the list which I think is fine. And this is the first step to a ranking that is numerical, right? Where it's not a categorical, but a numerical ranking. And that will happen. And that will happen in our day. One of our listeners, if you want to do it, just start doing it now. You could look at impact factor. You could look at selectivity, time to review a few other characteristics, create a ranking, put it on your website. Within a couple of years, AIS will adopt it, and you'll be good to go.
So maybe a final thought. Sorry, Cathy, you'll have the final word.
I'm the guest. Can I have the final word?
Yes. Before you get your final word, let me have my final word. I also think we shouldn't pay too much attention to these things. You know what's going to change tomorrow now that we moved the basket of 6 to 8 to 11? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Yeah. No. So I selected publications and submitted them to these journals, whether it be INM, DSS, or BISA for that matter, long before they were added there. Why? Because I thought they were a good fit for some reason. I thought they were a good fit. Maybe it was a regional thing, like a German study published in a German journal, whatever. Yeah. And I thought they were good journals. And tomorrow on, I'll do exactly the same. Yeah, so that's what I mean. Like, it's a little bit pointless. We can debate about this, but tomorrow, when I talk to my students about where do we publish this stuff, these things don't really matter all that much. It's still about what's the conversation, what's the method, where does it fit the editorial board, where does it fit the vision of the journal? And these journals, we're in a lucky situation; they're all pretty good. And we have to be honest. I think we have lots of them. We have about 25 decent journals for such a small field. We're fine. Yeah. We don't need any of this. That's my final word. Cathy, you go.
Cathy, take us home.
Okay, final, just a small correction on the issue of BISA. It really was a case that the metrics weren't quite there yet. We thought it could be reviewed in about 3 years' time. We could see the trajectory. No, I don't.
She hates BISA. She doesn't like Germans. She's anti-German.
No. Oh, yes. So my history proves this. So I think that's, so BISA is still under consideration, but we were very careful. We wanted a credible metrics-based case, and BISA wasn't there quite yet, but it's on its way. So we expect it to come through. Now, the second part, I think we should be optimistic about the future of the senior scholars list. I think there is some merit in all three of our conclusions, really, that what's going to happen at a certain point is we're going to end up with a ranking of information systems journals. And that may be what we need to evolve to. Now we have lots of other external lists. It may be that this internal kind of distinction about what are the best ones has, lost its distinction. And we don't actually need to do that anymore. There's a couple of things I want to add, though. It's never going to be just an issue of the metrics. And I go back to Exhibit A. I know that if you've been in contact with the journal, you know how good it is. But if you've never published there, you're just looking on the metrics. You don't know why the metrics are so good. And I think so you're always going to have that kind of subjective evaluation as well in some kind of robust process, because metrics are too easily manipulated. But I think, we've got a bright future. I think those journals have a bright future. And there's one final thing I want to add. Journals, like stocks and shares, they can go up, but they can come down. And I actually think that if you have a robust process for evaluating journals to go up, even though you've got a conversation then about what happens to those people who published the journal when it was, say, a 4 and has gone back down to a 3, it's really important that the journal knows that it can go down again. And that's a possibility. Otherwise, you just get inflation and the whole idea of a rank list becomes meaningless. So I think that's something, it's a shame we didn't have more time to talk about that, because it has an effect on people's careers, but there should be innovative ways to get round those kind of issues as well.
Agreed.
We'll have to get you back on, probably in 2024 if we're still around.
Oh, you will be. Thank you so much. I've had a lot of fun, as always, talking to the two of you.
It was a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure. Take care of yourself.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye. See you next time.
Bye.